Hi, everybody. Welcome to Histories of Design. We're thrilled to have Silas Munro with us. There he is. He's going to be sharing his talk with us momentarily. We're thrilled to have him with us. First, Laura is going to be giving a couple of announcements and introducing Silas.
Thank you, Dolores. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Laura Rossi Garcia, and I'm faculty in the School of Design as well as co-chair of the School of Design Talks. It is my pleasure to introduce Silas Munro today. Silas is a partner of Polymode, a bi-coastal design studio in the United States that creates poetic research, learning design, artistic practice, and applied design with clients in the cultural sphere and community-based organizations, including MoMA, the Phillips Collection, the New Museum, and Mark Bradford at the Venice Biennale. Silas has been a visiting critic at MICA, RISD, and Yale University, and he's also an associate professor at Otis College of Art and Design, and advisor and chair emeritus at Vermont College of Fine Arts. Welcome, Silas.
Hi, thanks, Laura. Thanks, Dolores and Heather, and I see Robin in here too, some people that I know, and glad to be here. So I'm going to be giving a talk about W.E.B. Du Bois, which I've been giving a lot of talks recently, including this new series that I'm really excited about that's BIPOC Center Design History. So I pre-recorded this, but still good. And then I'll be here to answer questions afterwards. I'm really honored. This lineup is amazing that you've been having. So I'm really honored to be one of the speakers among you. So I'm going to share my screen and share sound. And then that should... The continued murder of Black people due to systemic racism in the form of police brutality shows the continued importance of the work W.E.B. Du Bois and his students did. This doesn't take away from the fact that I'm feeling quite emotional at the moment. I want to give myself and you all permission to accept the difficult reality of feeling all of it. In fact, design is an emotional act. There is a sensory quality to design that's all about feeling. I began by making a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Chumash, Tongva, Kitsch people, or what we now know as Inglewood in Los Angeles. I'm here to share some research that is very close to my heart. It's close to my heart because it's about art and design, which I love, and it's close to my heart because it's about identity and humanity that transcend race, color, creed, gender, sexuality, and nationality. It's about using design to create a kind of utopia, or at least the hope for utopia. The research I present today is collaborative and is the product of my contribution to W.E.B. Du Bois' Data Portraits, Visualizing Black America, a book edited by Whitney Battle Baptiste and Britt Russert, who are scholars of Du Bois at UMass Amherst, where Du Bois' papers are stored. There are additional essays by Mabel O. Wilson and Aldon Morris, the foremost living Du Bois scholar. Our book is published by Princeton Architectural Press, and I'm going to channel RuPaul and say you can order it now on Amazon or buy it wherever fine books are sold. Speaking of plugs, I want to signal boost the type designer of the typography in this presentation, who is Trey Seals of the Foundry Vocal Type. He has been digitizing all of Du Bois' letter forms from these diagrams into a font family called William. That being said, I would like to take you all on a journey, one through space and time. And I do need to give you a trigger warning that I'll be using historical terms that were appropriate at the time they were said, but conflict with our contemporary language. I also use humor, gallows really humor, in my talk to ground some of the darkness that I've faced in this work and research. Because I'm covering a lot, I've created a structure that is a menu We're going to start with an amuse-bouche, which is the color line. The appetizer is the Negro exhibit. The entree has two parts, the Georgia Negro and a series of statistical charts illustrating the condition of the descendants of former African slaves now in residence in the United States of America. And for dessert, we're going to wash that down with my art and design history and the implications for how this research can connect to new ways that art and design history could be taught and is being taught. And then we're going to have a digestive that will have some contemporary examples and end with a quote from James Baldwin. Widely known to be a prolific author and renowned sociologist, fierce civil rights advocate, co-founder of the NAACP, and historian of Black lives, W.E.B. Du Bois was also a pioneer of data visualization. One of his most famous quotes is, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." This quote was first published in his seminal Souls of Black Folk from 1903, and it's a quote that cuts through the intersection of race and class. But he also mentioned this quote in a lecture that he gave in 1900, and that's an important date. Because in 1900, Du Bois would explore this notion of a color line in literal and metaphorical ways, with a contribution of approximately 60 visualizations or infographics to an exhibit at the Exposition Universelle in Paris, which was basically the World's Fair. And the exhibition was dedicated to the progress made by African Americans since emancipation. Working in ink, gouache, watercolor, graphite, and sprinklings of photographic prints, Du Bois and his students and alumni collaborators at Atlanta University generated crisp, dynamic, and modern graphics as a form of infographic activism. So that brings us to the appetizer, which is the Negro exhibit, and we're going to the year 1900. So, of course, Du Bois was involved in the exhibit, but the American Negro exhibition was actually organized by a man named Thomas Junius Calloway. He was a lawyer, educator, Fisk University graduate. That's how Du Bois knew him. And was also the editor of the Colored American newspaper in Washington, D.C. And TJ, as he was called by his friends, with the endorsement and assistance of Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, who was a frenemy of Du Bois, petitioned the United States government to include in a display the industrial and imperial prowess, as well as a commitment to social reform that was centered around and dedicated to African American life. The American Negro exhibit featured many contributions by students and faculty at the Tuskegee Institute, Howard University, the Hampton Institute, and other Black colleagues in industrial schools. And Calloway was the one to reach out to Du Bois, who was a former classmate and friend, in the hopes that he would contribute this social study about African American life to the exhibit. And because of Booker T. Washington's connections to a number of historically, now what we call historically Black colleges, and had this perspective that was more connected to this idea of working labor as a form of emancipation. However, and this is actually when they were collaborating before the public split between Du Bois and Washington. In fact, at this time, they were considered intellectual supporters of each other, and Du Bois would have Booker T. read his speeches and lectures. But philosophically, this idea of Booker T. being this Southern agrarian accommodationist did not sit well with the Northern radical intellectual Du Bois.
Related to any natural or human-caused disaster.
Speaking of Northerners. William Edward Burger Du Bois, his full name, was called Webb to his friends. This is a photograph of Du Bois in Paris in 1900 when he's visiting the World's Fair, where his data portraits were on display. And just want to note the top hat. Du Bois was known for having baller headgear. Du Bois was born in 1868. That's 5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation began to free slaves in America. Here's a quote where he describes himself in his own diaries as, "In general thought and conduct, I became quite thoroughly New England." He was raised by his single mother and grandmother. As mentioned, he went to Fisk University, which was in Tennessee, and then to Harvard for a second bachelor's. He also earned a PhD in sociology, the first black man to do this. He studied abroad after his PhD in Berlin, so he would have been familiar with Europe by the time that he arrived in Paris. One thing to note on this trip, Du Bois would also visit London and be part of the first Pan-African Congress. Before he left for Paris, Du Bois began assembling the exhibit actually in December 28th of 1899. So the pace was quite fast and furious. And because the exposition began in April 15th in 1900 and the travel would take at least 6 weeks by ship, he didn't have much time. So Du Bois returned to his teaching position at Atlanta University, where he created the charts that would and he would enlist the women and men of color he taught. The infographics were the product of multiple forms of collaboration and co-creation. Across the diagrams, there are many references to Atlanta University, and the lead infographic of the second series of images explicitly states that it was prepared and executed by Negro students under the direction of Atlanta University. At Atlanta University, alumnus William Andrew Rogers, who had recently received his bachelor's degree in sociology, was the point person responsible for making and coordinating the design and production of the actual graphics. Few records remain about the working methods of Rogers, who may have been living in Petersburg, Virginia, when he worked on the project. Based on the volume of the designs, each piece's complexity and detail, and the compressed timeline of only a few months to prepare their portion of the American Negro exhibit, it seems implausible that Rogers and Du Bois worked alone to complete the project. Roger and Du Bois no doubt facilitated renderings and typesetting with additional unnamed Atlanta University students and alumni who assisted with the collection of field data. The collaborative nature of the work that went into the construction of the images, as well as their public exhibition, illuminate Du Bois's investment in a truly public sociology. Du Bois also turned to Atlanta alumni to construct a robust network of field researchers across the South. Black women were among the field researchers who contributed their expertise and labor to the Atlanta studies. And we might further speculate on how white working class patrons touring the American Negro exhibit in Paris interpreted and made meaning of this data on their own terms. Here, both viewers of the infographics and black study participants in the U.S. South come into view as legitimate co-producers of sociological knowledge. That is a quote from Britt and Whitney's essay that introduces the book. And paired with that, you can see images of Atlanta University students around the time that Du Bois was working on his exhibit. Here you can see an image of Du Bois's exhibitor pass as part of being the designer of the Negro exhibit. And it's really sort of heartbreaking and challenging to think about the conditions with which the design and Du Bois end up traveling to Paris. And I'm going to read a bit from his autobiography. The details of finishing these 50 or so charts in colors with accuracy was terribly difficult with little money, limited time, and not too much encouragement. I was threatened with nervous prostration before I was done and had little money left to buy passage to Paris, nor was there a cabin left for sale, but the exhibit would fail unless I was there. So at the last moment, I bought passage in steerage and went over and installed the work. And so this image of the graphic design actually getting there faster and easier than Du Bois did, and the idea of this globally educated intellectual traveling across the Atlantic in steerage in close proximity to the hull of the ship doesn't really sit comfortably with our image of Du Bois as a black intellectual or human being, and really actually serves as a kind of reverse middle passage is the way I see it, and has this tension between the kind of radical progress and modernity expressed in the diagrams that he didn't experience in his own travels. And when he arrived to Paris, the architectural and urban context of the city was this representation of a Europe transforming out of a Victorian era, leaving this fin de silice. There was this whole mindset of getting out of our dreary salons, dropping Victorian cynicism, pessimism, and ennui. And so he would have walked in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower, which was finished in 1889, shortly before he arrived. And the exhibit would be housed in the American Pavilion of the fair, which was in this Beaux Arts architectural style. And you can see here a souvenir from the exhibition that shows the U.S.'s pavilion was also positioned prominently nearby the pavilions of France, and the U.S. as this rising global political power. However, the Negro exhibit was not positioned in the most visible or glamorous place. It was hosted in the Palace of Social Economy. And there was nothing auspicious about this little right corner of the room. But to garner attention from this unenviable location, the exhibit would need to radiate its own sparkle and originality. And Du Bois and his team used a kind of imaginative resonance, which caused visitors to pause and marvel at the mysteries conveyed. And it was no small task giving this mission of the exhibit to talk about the complexities of African American life, but it successfully captivated thousands of curious visitors in the months it was on display. And just for context, there were about 30 to 50 million visitors to the World's Fair in general at large. And specifically, the Negro exhibit garnered a number of prestigious prizes, included a gold medal that was awarded to Du Bois by the judges for his role as a collaborator and compiler of the materials of the exhibit. And you can see in the space of the exhibit, which was ingeniously designed and densely packed with information and visuals, that Du Bois, rather than relying on the kind of tabletop model of presentation that was often used at World's Fairs, that kind of diorama thing, like if you think of going to a natural history museum where you see like a prehistoric scene of Neanderthals like on display. Instead, Du Bois and his team used information design as a rhetorical device, and there's photo documentation that shows at least half of the present diagrams are actually mounted in wing frames set on movable standards that allowed fairgoers to flip through large double-sided plates of the rich data at eye level. The American Negro exhibit featured many contributions by students and faculty of the Black schools that I mentioned: Tuskegee Institute, Howard University, Hampton Institute, as well as other Black colleges and industrial schools. And the exhibit was meant to educate patrons about the forms of education and uplift occurring at Black institutions in African American communities across the U.S. South. And it features an eclectic set of objects, images, and texts, including framed photographic portraits of prominent African American leaders and politicians, tools, harnesses, and other agricultural products from these Black industrial schools. There's a bronze statuette of Frederick Douglass that is on the left, which is indicative of the importance of this phrase, the color line, because Frederick Douglass is actually the first person who actually uses that term, but Du Bois takes it and propagates it and links it to that problem of the 20th century. And in addition to the materials in the exhibit, there was also one of the photo frames was carved by a former slave. And you have all this evidence. There's publications by Black authors, there's patents. It's really this amazing interactive and haptic display context. And here you can see the gold medal that was given to Du Bois as part of his innovation. And so what happens after the exhibition for the several months of the World's Fair is that the entire exhibit is packed up, shipped, and displayed at a number of other World's Fairs and expositions back in the United States. This is where Du Bois and the exhibition gains additional audiences, including African Americans, after its international debut in Paris. And for example, there's a group of Black club women who worked to bring the exhibit to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York in 1901. And it's clear that Du Bois was continuing to think about the infographics that his team prepared for the exhibit. In fact, in 1901, he wrote Callaway to ask how he might secure the return of his exhibit from the Library of Congress, where artifacts and documents from the American Negro exhibit had been deposited. So the current existence of why these images have come to prominence is because they were digitized, and it suggests that Du Bois was either unable to get the plates back or wasn't able to follow up because of all of his other extensive output. Pairing with that exhibit, here's a souvenir for the American Negro exhibit at that Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, where you can actually see Du Bois and Callaway standing and sitting in the exhibition, and you can see that the exhibition, because of its modularity, is actually reconfigured into a new form and format, and actually has additional material, including some of the charts reconfigured. So the ingenious nature of the design allowed for a kind of flexibility, a kind of reconfiguration. I hope you are starting to get your appetite satisfied, because we have more content coming. So here's the entree, and here's where I'm going to actually get into the meat, or tofu, if you will, of the material, which is these data visualization charts that come in these two different sets. And so these were basically finished in the shadow of 1899. And to give you some additional sense of Du Bois's mindset, I'm going to play an audio recording of Du Bois speaking to Moses Ashe in the late 60s. Ashe actually did a autobiography with Du Bois about his life, and in this couple-minute clip, Du Bois is reflecting on his time at Atlanta University and is talking about some of the impetus for his need to act and create something to deal with the brutality of racism and oppression that lingered in the Jim Crow South after slavery.
In 18 1997, I went to Atlanta University and stayed there 13 years, making a systematic study of the American Negro, which wasn't well done because we didn't have money enough or personnel to carry it out. But nevertheless, it's fair to say that for the next 25 years, there wasn't a book published on the Negro problem that didn't have to depend upon what we were doing at Atlanta University. It was the first study of the sort. Ours was the first institution in the United States, white or black, that had any course on the history of the American Negro or on Negro history in general. So that it was a good beginning. But while I was there, my faith in knowledge as a solution of the Negro problem was shaken. Lynching was common. Before I went away from there was an average of one lynching every week for some years. And it was a terrible sort of thing. There was one case very near Atlanta in which I knew from my studies just what had happened. It was a case of a Negro peasant not receiving his wages at the end of the season. He got in a fight with his hirer and killed him and ran away. And then when they couldn't find him, they raised the altogether new issue that he had raped the man's wife, which was evidently just dragged in. Well, I had a letter which I hadn't delivered to Joel Chandler Harris, the author of the Uncle Remus tales. He was then on the Atlanta Constitution. So I took that letter and started downtown to deliver it to him and to talk to him about this situation. And on the way down, I found that this Negro, Sam Hose, had been caught and lynched, and that in the meat market, which was on the way I had to pass, his fingers and toes were being exhibited. Well, I didn't deliver the letter. I went back to Atlanta University. And then I made up my mind that knowledge wasn't enough. That even if people were ignorant of essential matters which they had to know, they wouldn't correct their actions without more realization of just what the difficulties were. They had not only to know, but they had to act.
So this image of Du Bois having these very brutal implications of the hangover of slavery translated into these very dynamic, powerful visualizations that were a way to change public sentiment. And Du Bois and his students understood and knew the importance of framing not only the notion of slavery, but the context of where it came from. And Du Bois's dissertation was about the transatlantic slave trade, and he took that knowledge and translated it into a visual representation of this. There is a deeper read of this map by Mabel Wilson, who's an amazing architectural critic, and really the first scholar who writes about this exhibit and this work in her book, Negro Buildings. I highly recommend reading it if you want to know more context. And I think what is really powerful about this diagram is the way in which color and this mapping of the slave trade through the Middle Passage to emancipation beyond. Du Bois uses data sets as a way to make arguments for the equality and sophistication of Black Americans living under Jim Crow and in the shadow of enslavement. And you can actually see in a detailed look at the text where that quote related to the color line is presented as the closing line. And I'm also really interested in the language that Du Bois uses, where he's providing this graphic design as a form of evidence, where he says there's charts, maps, and particularly this other devices, which I really love as a kind of way of talking about innovation or this unusual approach to positioning this argument, and was connected to work that he said in that speech, where he's talking about to the nations of the world, where he's talking about Pan-African solidarity and also decolonizing the Black world. In the cover of the second set of plates, which I see as a proclamation in type and image form, it's also one of the most dense of the plates and self-referential. Here you can see those calls to Atlanta University as this collective authorship of the data visualizations that follow. The palette of gouache in bright colors continues from this Georgia study, and one of the key differences between the data in the Georgia study and this series of charts is, in the Georgia study, it's focused on the data of Georgians and at the state, and then in this body of work, it's more looking at national census data. And the layout and all the charts features this strategic mix of typographic families and styles, and the principal type here, which appears to be a sans serif or grotesque typeface, both of which predate the 20th century, is not that. It's actually, on closer inspection, a letter style that's used in the charts has no curves. There's only straight lines, and it's more akin to lettering generated by templates designed for architectural or engineering plans. And based on the author's trainings in sociology rather than in graphic design, it would make sense that the students at Atlanta University would have used some templates and pre-existing tools. And the residue of technical lettering, most likely from an American architectural lettering template, is especially visible in the lighter weights of the hand-rendered type utilized for the French translations, because Du Bois was thinking about this global multilingual audience in France, evidenced in these non-standard weight of the heavier diacritic marks. So you can see the accents were not part of this American template, so they had to be improvised and modified by his team. Made a decade before the rise of dominant European avant-garde movements, these works predate modular design elements, often considered to have their origins in Russian constructivism, Gestalt, and Italian futurism. This plate that shows the population of slaves and free Negroes is particularly striking because you see this intentional use of texture and form. Colors are referencing the Pan-African Congress, but also the nature of Black skin and the blood of those who were enslaved and persecuted. Overall in the plates, the modular elements that are used consistently are typically composed of abstract shapes that are built from circles, triangles, and rectangles, often used in bright primary colors or black and white, which have a high level of detail and finesse, even in this coloring that you can see in the numbers inscribed in the circle. And when I look at this work, I can't help think about work that comes later. I had mentioned aspects of the avant-garde. You know, this work was made 19 years before the founding of the Bauhaus, but folks like Herbert Bayer, who's one of the first Bauhaus masters who came out of being a student at the program and led the typography and graphic design workshop, had created this universal alphabet that was built out of these modular elements. And when I look at some of the other charts, I think about the implications of the Bauhaus, which is this German art and design school, which is famous for offering a rigorous foundation to the students and focused on this idea of form and isolation, asking students to experiment with different mediums and different forms in a separation from meaning, but then was used to create dynamic visuals. And when I look at this chart that talks about taxable property owned by Georgia Negroes, you also get this reference to Kandinsky, who was one of the Bauhaus masters that would have been Herbert Bayer's teacher, and also was 19 at the time of this World's Fair. So who's to say he didn't experience or see these charts? Has this really powerful bullseye where you see wedges of these numerical values actually chiseling and cutting through these different forms dead into the center. And my argument is that Du Bois didn't make these forms in a vacuum. He had a lot of schooling, both in sociology, but also in this idea of statistical data, and no doubt would have been familiar with the sort of father of what we consider information design, which is the work of the Scottish statistician William Playfair, who is credited with inventing the modern pie chart, bar chart, area chart. So Du Bois would have models that he was looking at to create his visualizations and to try to clarify complex data sets in this kind of quick read. And Playfair was a pioneer of really trying to use the eye as a way of understanding a lot of information very quickly. Another antecedent to Du Bois is the work of Florence Nightingale, who created a type chart called a rose diagram. And Florence Nightingale was a nurse, British nurse in the army, and she's known for not only doing dynamic, beautiful visualization, but linking that to social change and creating a shift in the public military policy of the British Army, when she discovered through her research that the soldiers were dying more from unsanitary hospital conditions than they were in the field of battle in the Crimean War. And one of the reasons her diagram is called a rose is that the segmented shifting pie chart that she created looks like a flower. The colors, shapes, and typography of the charts also foreshadow critical developments in the history of data visualization, including simplified pictographic form, which you see later in the isotype picture language, which I'll show a little bit later. But if you look at this chart, it has this very literally bags of money that represent value of land owned by Georgia Negroes. And contrasting that, here is a image of the isotype picture language, which was created by Marie and Otto Neurath, who are husband and wife design team in Vienna as part of the Vienna Secession, and sort of the things that were happening around other design intellectuals like Adolf Loos, who were trying to find this rational way to talk about data by using repeated images. And you can see from this fragment of their body of work sort of the problematic colonial implications of trying to flatten the world into representations. And Du Bois and his team struggle with this as well, particularly with a series of two diagrams, one from the Georgia study about race amalgamation in Georgia, which is looking at this aspect of colorism within the Black community, where people of darker skin tone were considered less upwardly mobile, less valuable than those who had mixed, either who were brown or, we hear this term, high yellow, persons with more white than Negro blood. And what's really interesting about seeing this chart, which is a bar chart, compared with the area chart version of this for the national data, you see this contrasting ways of visualizing the same information. And additionally, you see some typographic variation, which comes from the fact that these teams are working in different places and working very rapidly, where they actually start printing some of the headlines with letterpress type that's different and combined with the stencil template. And there's so much variation to these diagrams. I'm really blown away by the power of this chart about Negro businessmen in the United States, which to me looks like a monochrome painting, like something that Mondrian or Mark Rothko would create. And you can see really the precision of detail, both in color, typographic alignment, scale, and proportion, that in some of the plates, which are actually damaged because of the quality of paper, which is a wood pulp paper and has inherent vice. It's part of the reason why you can't see these in person and why they've been digitized so carefully by the Library of Congress. Also have these typographic anomalies where you can tell the script of likely of one of Du Bois's students is showing up in these charts. One of the powerful things about the charts is also you see new kinds of chart types showing up. This I call the Du Boisian spiral, which is very much similar to the visual language of the kind of typographic style that we'll see later in the century in the international typographic style. I'm thinking of Swiss masters like Joseph Müller-Brockmann. And the innovation just keeps coming. Here we see a heat map of Negro population in Georgia counties in 1890 using that gouache, which is also an interesting material that Swiss graphic design schools, which heavily influence graphic design education in America, also use. It's a kind of matte, flat version of watercolor. Gouache and also placa are these kind of inks that become indicative of creating this flat graphic style that we know of as modernistic graphic design. And it's really amazing that these innovations don't appear anywhere in the work of, say, the researcher Edward Tufte, who is a prolific writer of scholarship around information design. So the question begs, like, why are these diagrams only now being considered as part of a larger canon of graphic design? And that has to do with the erasure, both from sociologists of Du Bois's work, as well as the fact that these pieces were made as one-offs. They're not multiple. So even though they're exhibited and seen by a lot of people abroad and in the States, they kind of had this shadow life where they just went to the Library of Congress and haven't surfaced until 2016, 2017, where they're digitized. I love this other iteration of the Du Boisian spiral that has this really refined looping form in the center. You see Du Bois also tackle societal issues like literacy or illiteracy, and showing and comparing illiteracy levels in Black Americans, as well as the literacy levels in other charts of those in other countries that would have been on display at the World's Fair, like France and Germany. And the last plate that I'll show you is this amazing piece of design that almost looks like it was designed this year, which is about income and expenditure of Negro families. It includes complex sets of colors, spatial dynamics, photographs, multiple type styles, and a little bit of gold foil, just a little bling going on. One of the things that's also really significant about this is you see this instruction to the audience to interact with it. So for further statistics, you can raise the frame. And so, even though Du Bois and his team were hardly the first to visualize data with this level of rigor in the pre-computation era, these designs are unique and important. And the rhetorical innovation in the social sciences, coupled with a visual aesthetic very much at home in the 21st century, makes for a prescient body of design work. And these visualizations offer a prototype of design practices that are not widely utilized until more than a century later, anticipating the trends now vital in our contemporary world of design for social innovation, data visualization, service to social justice, and the decolonization of pedagogy. Which brings me to the next course, which is going forward in time to the year 2000, which is the beginning of my own design and art history. And why I'm still, after being with these plates for a while, gagged over the fact that I never heard about these in school. None of these were mentioned, and why. I had amazing design history teachers at RISD, Doug Silverfox Scott, who me and all the other students, sophomores and grad students had a crush on, for sure. And then Lorraine Fierce Wild, who was my design history professor at Cal Arts, which are both really amazing schools. And both of these teachers, who were educated at Yale, one of the best MFA programs in design in the United States, would have been influenced by Philip Meggs, who wrote the first book on graphic design history. They had professors, both American and European professors, like the famous designer Paul Rand, or the other American Bradbury Thompson. There were just so many other educators there. At the same time, Lou Danziger, who wrote the first design history course for really an undergraduate program at Cal Arts and Art Center. So that would have influenced Lorraine when she came to teach at Cal Arts after her schooling. And then also Lorraine was taught by Kathy McCoy at Cranbrook, who also infused a lot of new ideas in design and design history. But what you can see by looking at the faces of these amazing people is you don't see someone who looks like me. And part of the problematic nature, not only of who's represented, but how the representation happens, which is, to me, generally, most design history classes are based off of this modernist celebrity clothesline, where you have this set number of objects that start with cuneiform and ancient Sumeria and work their way mainly through a European American context and mainly of white male designers, and generally does not really think about the contemporary implications of design after the 20th century. So I propose a few other models. I propose a nodal model where you can be affected and impacted, of course, by your teachers, Herbert Bayer and Walter Gropius, or Joseph Mueller-Brockman and Max Bill are contemporaries who are operating in each other's milieu and influencing each other. But you can also have this idea of like a chosen family. Like I get to choose W.E.B. Du Bois to be part of my design lineage, a kind of graphic design history string theory. And that brings me to kind of my latest model of thinking about this idea of both the major and minor forces of design history. What happens when you start to bring and reconsider the canon of graphic design history, or any history, when you start to reframe it with the implications of Du Bois being this major innovator, and that shifts how we can now think about these things like isotype or De Stijl or the Bauhaus. And you could also extend that to an entire term or series of terms in a syllabi or textbooks, which I'm doing right now with my own design history classes and scholarship. So, for example, a lecture about streamlining in the 1930s can be reframed through the lens of Victor Hugo Green's The Negro Motorist Green Book. And you could explore and consider the nature of planned obsolescence developed by the American automobile industry that shapes the modern condition of craving the new, and how in tandem the exclusionary urban building and political policy made the utopian visions of World's Fairs and Art Deco unavailable to marginalized populations in America. You could also remodel the late 1960s America mid-century modernism like the Eames aluminum lounger into a context that looks at the political unrest of the Memphis sanitation worker strike and the Japanese poster work of Tadanori Yoku, or the Bay Area psychedelic posters of Victor Moscoso. And so you have one set of Americans reclining in their chairs while you have another set of workers or Americans marching for their lives literally in piles of refuse. And so for me, the way I've taken this pedagogy into practice and to wash it all down is this digestive of what does it mean now in the 21st century, this contemporary impact of this radical transformation that can come from Du Bois. And so first we have just the type we're looking at. In this presentation, the work of Trey Seals, a vocal type, who is all about creating typefaces that come out of these lineages of protests. And he has done typefaces related to the sanitation workers strike poster that's now typeface called Martin. But in this presentation, you're looking at William, which I mentioned earlier, as a way to give us a different typographic voice that doesn't come from the same closed circle of type design, which is usually even more exclusionary than graphic design, and it has, because of its connection to tech, largely been associated with design bros for lack of a better term. And this has been also connected to a workshop that I led with students in Philadelphia in 2019, where I asked and collaborated with students to take the work of Du Bois and think about the implications for Philadelphia, where Du Bois also lived and did his own unique study on the Philadelphia Negro that set up and informed the work that I've been talking today, where the students did both qualitative and quantitative research into ways to look at Philadelphia, which is one of the fourth most segregated cities in the United States, through these new lenses of things that are relevant. This is before George Floyd's death, but one of the students looked at police-involved shootings. There was this look at crime mapping in ethnic districts, hate crimes and extremism, looking at the gayborhood, which is a historically queer neighborhood, and using the way that we sort of look at the notion of double consciousness as a way to survey their own classmates. It also inspires contemporary art. This is the work of Theaster Gates, the multidisciplinary Chicago-based artist who has taken Du Bois's diagrams and stripped them of their type and functionality as information vehicles and put them into a kind of graphic abstraction that actually elevates Du Bois's visual language and the visual language of Theaster Gates into this kind of pantheon of 20th century modernist paintings, but in a very 21st century time, which I think are just striking and beautiful. They're silkscreen on aluminum and also take the form of these neons, which abstract Du Bois's form into this kind of radical, contemporary, Afrofuturistic abstraction. To close, I leave you with this James Baldwin quote, which actually comes from an essay that he wrote called White Man's Guilt that was originally published in Ebony magazine in 1965. And he's talking about this burden that we have to come and face. And he says, on the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all we do. And, that comes to this point where he's sort of later talking about this awakening of the great pain and terror when we begin to realize that our frames of reference, our identities and aspirations are shaped by history, and that we enter into a battle with this historical creation, and we get to attempt to recreate ourselves into a principle that is more humane and more liberating. And I hope that this talk and this perspective help you do the same thing in the way that you look at data visualization, and the way that we consider, particularly in this age of social reckoning, and also the impact of a debilitating pandemic where we're confronted with data visualization in our feeds and in our world all the time, that we can actually use this data and data visualization as a medium to create social change. Thank you so much.
So one of the things I'm struck by is just how beautiful the illustrations and the charts are, and how, they just make you ache with the beauty of it. And it makes, as some people mentioned, you long to emulate it. It's inspiring. And his stories and the way that you had the audio of his voice there were so moving. And I think it really speaks to the power of what he's doing, and also how you're presenting the material, which is a great gift to all of us. And I just have to tell people that the BIPOC Design Histories is a magnificent kind of learning experience for everyone, and that their students can join it for a much smaller prize and can apply for scholarships. So
totally. Yeah, it's like less than probably Philip Megg's book, or like around that, and there's 13 lectures. There's also a sliding scale for BIPOC students, so that's it's half the price. And if anyone has problems, there's a lot of people who want to give scholarships to students, both BIPOC and non-BIPOC students. So there's an email, it's class@BIPOC Design History. So if you're interested. And then right now, 12 of the 13 lectures are posted that have happened. So we're posting the last one that Audrey Bennett did on Sunday, which is really amazing, which for the teachers in the room, that one's about ways to think about sort of teaching, non-white, non-European aesthetics in design, and sort of how that works in pedagogy. One of the cool things about that was also her husband, Ron Eglash, was there, who wrote this book, African Fractals. And he had a really interesting point of view for white allies and how to do their own lineage work, and look at indigenous cultures that are, kind of that we consider white. For example, my dad is from Minnesota, but my last name is Scottish in origin. And so actually a friend, Heather, gave me a tartan, a Munro tartan, which is has a Celtic lineage, so that's those were the indigenous people before the British, came to Scotland and colonized. So colonization, it doesn't just affect BIPOC people. I mean, it affects us more than others, but I think there's like a lot of these diagrams in particular, and like Du Bois's work, I think gives us a lot of new entry points to reconsider like design practice and design history. And it's just, you're right, Dolores, it just, even watching it again, I was having a bit of an out of body experience, but like the work is so incredible. It's so beautiful and so powerful, and such a strong argument for equality at a time way before like even the Bauhaus. Like that's like, it just, I'm like gagged every time still. Sorry to say that, but I think it's, we can learn a lot from even mimicking or being inspired by all of it.
Yes.
Oh, cool. Thanks, Patricia, about the future of history. That's awesome. Be great if the series was a requirement for design history. Yeah, no, we are like doing institutional licenses too. So like for schools, there can be discounts, like pretty heavy discounts to do like groups of students or faculty. So that's something we're super interested in. And like now we're talking to libraries too about how to put them in there and eventually turn it into a book. And I feel like kind of what I was talking about at the end with the different expanded histories, like even our BIPOC class, I feel like only scratches the surface. So like you could do, people were talking about other ideas for other classes, but then we also, like some people have requested talking about Latinx design history, arc, and then like other indigenous histories. So hopefully we can keep talking about this, because I think it's hopefully it's like ongoing and not just kind of a flavor of the month.
We've requested this through DePaul, and it also occurred to me that it could be a kind of a subscription through the library.
Totally. So yeah,
that's a possibility.
Totally. We're looking at that and also really trying to make it like accessible, like because that's a lot of users. And so really like as more people watch it, it would become more affordable for institutions. So we like just kind of figured that out. So we'll be responding to people who make those inquiries now. And we really just want to get it out there. So we're working with people on that. But thanks. Other questions about Du Bois or anything about design history in general?
I just want to say thank you so much, Silas. Like, I attended a couple of the BIPOC, the Black Design in America. I kind of caught the last two, but it's just, I feel there's just such a electric sort of energy around those spaces and those conversations, and it's just so exciting. I'm just like blown away by what you're doing, and I've been doing a lot of reading, just trying to figure out, what is history, because what we've been taught is so off, and so just having these lectures and learning real history is really exciting. So thank you.
You're welcome. So I saw you in the last couple ones and your name fly by, and I'm so grateful that you came to those and that you came today as well. And you feel free to take your time. That's the nice thing about the asynchronous. You can watch them, when you want to at your schedule, and there's like a Discord chat. But I feel like you're right, Robin, and for me, like bearing witness to the lectures, because a lot of the talks are, some of them are collaborative with me and Tashika Arsenio Sutton, who gave a talk just, a couple days ago, and Pierre Bowens, just like a week before that in a series. We've like learned a ton ourselves. So it's kind of like just digesting all of that, I think, is a lot. And like, I'm a big fan of like giving your body time to catch up to the truth of like what we're seeing. Cause there's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of like processing, and like you're saying, Robin, why do we have to like rediscover everything? You start kind of getting this like, whoa, I have to rethink everything. To give yourself time, anyone with this.
I think it's interesting, excuse me, the format of it is so interesting because, I mean, number one, it's preserving these talks. And I have listened to people that I've read, but never actually seen them. And to see someone give a presentation is so engaging. Some people are they're all so well spoken. And then to have this collection of so many different voices in one place, it's, I think someone had mentioned it should be required history, and it's so much more accessible than a book with little tiny postage stamp pictures. It just is, it's the hyperlinks into, there's so many hyperlinks that went through the chat at the time that it's a living history. It's or a future of a living history. It's an amazing collection.
Yeah, Cheryl Miller you're welcome. Cheryl Miller, I saw her talk again yesterday because she's like speaking a lot of places, and she keeps talking about these footnotes, leaving footnotes. And I feel like that's what I've hoped to do with this. Like, there's so many other additional things that other scholars have been learning about Du Bois, and the talk in the BIPOC is with Jason Forrest, who's amazing data visualization person, and adds, like, he's found plates that I didn't see in my research. So it's living. So that's also really good to think about it. Like, we're not fixed, like we don't have like the answer or the history. Hi, Natasha.
Yeah, I have a question. Hi.
Yeah, please.
So my question is exactly about that, about the research. So if it was too complicated to access documents, and basically like, it's a very extensive research into the details that you have, and also suggestions for conducting similar research.
Yes.
With the same person like Du Bois, but like, what things would you suggest to keep in mind?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's I think I was really lucky because I had Britt and Whitney, who are archivists of Du Bois. Like, they teach about him, they're scholars, and so they knew their way around the digital archives of his papers. And so they were kind of guides for us other scholars. And then also, like, paving the way. Mabel Wilson, several years ago wrote about this exhibit, like before anyone, like even before Theester Gates was using them for his work. And so I think that's like kind of following other people's footsteps is a good suggestion. Like, if you're interested in the topic, like, find a book or like a resource, and then like read the footnotes, like follow like Jason did that. He came to my talk, and then he was like, oh, and he was like asking questions and in archives. And so I think even though COVID prevents us from going in person certain places, I think there are a lot of things that are digitized, and COVID is actually getting institutions to get more on their game with digitizing their archives. So it's like creating more access. So like even the National African American History Museum has like only a fraction of its things digitized, but what it does have digitized is amazing. So you can find a lot of kind of links by looking at specific things in archives. And I think also, as a visual person, spending time really looking at things closely and giving yourself the same skills you use as a practitioner of design, I think that's sort of what maybe could make us different as design historians, because of the kind of visual way that we're processing things and processing text and references. And then also just I share this, and so I'm like learning new things. Like right now, I was talking to a woman who runs the design department at Central St. Martin's and has done like all this PhD research. And she was suggesting because I was looking in newspapers in Paris, because I'm trying to find, are there accounts in Europe of like how people responded. And she was like, oh, at that time, not as many people read. So there's this publication called Les Illustrations, which was like the first illustrated newspaper, like before it was just text. And so now I'm like combing through that. So you can like, I think if you just kind of have an interest in something, like start building your footnotes and your citations, and then you can like, you'll discover things along the way. that's a great question. Thank you.
One question that has come up is, how do you do research together?
Oh, collaborative research.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it requires a lot of like open dialogue, I think. And for me, I'm such a stickler for acknowledging references and like who influenced me. Like, I think I feel lucky that I have this kind of photographic memory where I can basically remember where I heard or who I heard things from. Like it's almost impossible for me to like kind of forget things. And so I realized for me, like this task was also so big. It was like bigger than one person and one academic or one educator, one designer. And so I think when you come from that place, like pretty much everyone that I've talked to and all the people that agreed to be part of class said yes to that. Like we're open and like knowing that I was going to acknowledge and respect their work, and that we could learn from each other and they could learn from each other. And so I think that is like creates this feeling of openness. And then also contracts are good as well. So like clear, no, seriously, clear language in writing, you know, that says like all of the scholars can take what they did and put it in their own books. And there's many other books that are happening as well out of it. Like Kelly Walters is part of a collective, and Audrey Bennett has like published already. Like there's, you know, Colette, all of them, everyone is like Omari, all of them are working on their own things. And so it's this space where everyone can kind of have shared knowledge, but then it respects the copyright holder of the person who is doing that specific space of research, and it also respects their point of view too, and that we can have different points of view too and be productive and like agree to disagree in a healthy collegial way rather than like some other possible way. The plates are at the Library of Congress, and so actually anyone can download the image, like high-res TIFFs or JPEGs of the images.
Can you see them in person? Like, are they ever exhibited or?
Jason got to see them. He got to see one.
Wow. Cool.
And like, he had to like really like battle for that. So like rarely are they seen in person.
Probably
because
super
they're
light sensitive, right?
Yeah, they're wood pulp, you know, so they have inherent vice. They're not, you know, cloth. They're not archival. They were made with like inexpensive paper at the time because they didn't have a huge budget. So
yeah,
that's why you don't see them exhibited places.
Yeah.